It's always awkward waiting for that, like, because we have a virtual audience, I feel like I have to wait until it's exactly 9.
Yes. Are our microphones on or off? I think they're on. Okay.
Yeah. If you want to turn it off, I think that button is. All right. Good morning. Welcome to the second day of our symposium, Science-Based Choices for Climate Action. Very glad to see those of you who are here in the room with us at Dickinson College. Also welcome to those who are watching the virtual live stream. We had, I'm not sure how many people are watching on the virtual live stream, but we had 3,000 people register to attend the symposium, whether that's in person or via live stream. And I have to give some thanks to those who helped us reach that large of a group of folks who registered. So of course it included the IPCC Communications Office, but we also have a number of supporting organizations that I want to thank and call out. The Natural Resources Defense Council, the Association for Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education, Second Nature, ICLE USA, the U.S. chapter of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Citizens Climate Education and Lobby, who have been like stalwarts showing up for every session, so thank you very much. Our Climate, START International, the Global Council for Science and the Environment, the Institutional Endowments Network, and the Stonehouse Group. So we're really pleased to have so many organizations. They started coming to us to say, hey, can we help you promote this event? So we've been really pleased with that. So before we get started here, just to kind of point out for if there is an emergency, we've got an exit off to my left in that direction. We've got 2 exits at the top right and left. And there's also an exit back through the curtains. That's a handicapped accessible exit, and we'll get those curtains out of your way. We'll have opportunities for questions during this session. If you're watching virtually, you can type your questions into the chat of the YouTube Live. And so now I'll turn it over to Professor Rachel Jacobs, who's our moderator for our first session today.
Thank you so much. I am really honored to be moderating this session. I'm going to just first introduce our speakers, and then we will have some questions that we've already prepared, after which I will open the floor to questions from our audience, both in person and online. So I'm going to go alphabetically. That seemed the most fair. So first we have Barrett, the Vice Chair of the IPCC. She's a Senior Advisor for Climate at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, where she provides strategic advice and scientific leadership for climate research, applications, and services to coordinate and integrate across NOAA's portfolio of climate-related programs. In 2015, she was one of the first women elected to serve as vice chair of the IPCC. And for over 15 years, she has represented the United States on delegations charged with negotiating and adopting scientific assessments undertaken by the IPCC. She has also served as a lead negotiator for the United States on the United Nations Treaty on Climate Change. So welcome, Co.
Thank you, Rachel.
Next, we have Fatima Denton, the director of the United Nations University Institute for Natural Resources in Africa, and the IPCC Working Group 3 author. And she has worked with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa and Ethiopia since 2012. Her roles included Director of Natural Resource Management Division and Coordinator of the African Climate Policy Center. Dr. Denton is a lead author for the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land, and a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report, Working Group 3, and for the 4th and 5th reports, Working Group 2, and for the IPCC Special Report on Renewable Energy and Climate Change Mitigation. And so welcome, and thank you for joining us on Zoom, and please nudge or use the raise hand function if we are not getting your answer. Just please make sure that you let me know to give you the floor. And lastly, we have Benjamin Preston, who is a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation and director of Community Health and Environmental Policy, a program of RAND social and economic well-being. He is also a professor at Pardee RAND Graduate School, and he is temporarily on leave from RAND to serve as the assistant director for climate services and adaptation in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. His recent research efforts include understanding the role of knowledge in climate risk management, analysis of disaster recovery options and their implementation in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, scenario analysis for a low-carbon future and the implications of COVID-19 for the delivery of infrastructure services. He is the lead author for the IPCC 6th Assessment Report and has contributed to the U.S. National Climate Assessment. And welcome, Benjamin. Thanks. So with that, I would love to start us off with some questions for the panel. So to start off, I think it would be great to learn a bit more about the IPCC process from a policy perspective, as that's really the focus of our panel today. So how does the IPCC work as a global process? And how might this be different from assessments and analyses that take place in an individual country?
Want me to jump in? I should probably, as a vice chair, I should pretend I know something about the organization. No, I'm kidding. The IPCC is really a unique handshake between scientists and governments. And it's just really remarkable to watch the process unfold, because scientists are nominated to write the reports. We go through a kind of iterative process of writing, drafting, reviewing, folks submitting comments. But that handshake where governments sign on to the report and, in fact, negotiate the summary word for word is really where that science policy interface takes place, right? And I think it's different from, say, a country level assessment. Because we have scientists and governments from all around the world reminding us that climate change is a global problem that requires a global solution, and it's really kind of embodied in the process itself, where we bring together the global community to kind of produce these reports. I don't know, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked on both the IPCC reports and also the U.S. National Climate Assessment. It's interesting to juxtapose those. I think the U.S. National Assessment in some ways is easier to undertake because it is focused on the United States, so it's less diverse, although the United States is still a big place. And the ambition of the national assessments, I think, has increased over time, in part to following the lead of where the IPCCs are heading. But I also think, at least in the U.S. context, the assessment tends to be more concise. It tends to be more maybe policy focused. It brings in more practitioners. It's really designed to be a report for the people. Whereas I think the IPCC is very much maintaining the sort of scientific assessment activity focused around delivering knowledge into a negotiation process. But I think there's an interesting sort of convergence over time in how the national assessments and the global assessments are done as they learn from one another.
Yeah. Would you like to add anything else?
Fatima?
I'm not sure we're hearing her.
I think you're on mute. There.
Sorry. Yeah, I think perhaps the only point I could add is the IPCC process, I think, does scientific, the scientific rigor part of the IPCC process. Yes, it is, scientific community that assesses the literature. But I think also it's important to say that it doesn't do research, because a lot of people have this sense that the IPCC does research, but it actually doesn't do research. But it does assess a very comprehensive sample, I'd say, of research, and it does it in a very thorough manner. And the scientific rigor is also very important. There is also an element of transparency as well. Because, the research that is assessed is research that's put under scrutiny. You do have a very rigorous review process where you get to see what has been said about the findings that you produce. And that is something that I think some other scientific bodies do not have. And you are obligated in the IPCC process to say what you've done with the review. You have to be able to say that you have either accepted a review or rejected a review, and you have to be able to say why. So you're not allowed to just basically say, yes, I've seen this and it's fine. You really have to demonstrate how you've dealt with it in the context of your of the report. So I think that's a very sort of distinct role that the IPCC plays that I haven't seen anywhere, especially the the review part. It's very, very rigorous. So that's what I would say for now. I mean, maybe if I could just add another point very quickly. I think the other part is that what I get from the IPCC is that sort of contestation of knowledge, because you are with a body of peers, and you can actually contest knowledge. You can actually go beyond certain orthodoxy of knowledge, and that can be reflected in your report. So I think that the IPCC always says that it's not, it's policy neutral. And I think that's a very important point to bear in mind, that the IPCC doesn't tell policymakers what to do. And IPCC scientists have the license to be able to really scrutinize and contest the literature and the findings of the literature. So that transparency and the neutrality that comes with it, the fact that it doesn't prescribe any policies, I think is very unique to the IPCC process.
Great. Thank you. So I think building off of that, the IPCC plays a very distinct role in the international climate policy process. But can you tell us a bit more about the role that it plays in this policy arena? I think you spoke really well to the scientific side of the question. But I'd love to hear more about the policy process and why it is and why the IPCC's role in particular is so important.
I mean, I'm happy to lead off on that. So I've asked myself this question many times. I remember after the 5th assessment report, I was probably exhausted and I was done. And after every iteration, there's this sort of reflection upon the process. And my reflection was, well, I'm glad we finished the 5th assessment report. Nobody's going to be silly enough to do that again. Only to find that there was already lots of support to move ahead. And so I started asking myself, like, well, what's going on here? And then I sort of did this hypothetical, right? So imagine a world where the IPCC never existed. How would that impact the sort of international policy process? And you quickly get in these nightmare scenarios where countries come into negotiations with their own science, right, and their own interpretations of the science and their own discussion of, oh, it should be 1.5, it should be 2, it should be 2.5, or even at an extreme, oh, this is all a hoax, I can't believe we're being dragged into this process in the first place. So the IPCC sort of takes that all away and becomes what, every nation in conjunction with the scientific community, to Ko's point, can agree upon as sort of the basis of knowledge, or to some extent, truth. And therefore, everybody comes into that process on, I wouldn't call it a level playing field, because it's not a level playing field, but at least having the same understanding of knowledge to work with. And that becomes extremely powerful for then keeping the policy process on the rails, avoiding, or to some extent, sort of heading off unproductive arguments and debates around science. And therefore, although, the IPCC, I wouldn't call it, a decision support tool. As Fatima said, we're not telling people what they should do. But I do think it's important sort of in this sort of passive decision support mode of keeping forward momentum going in the policy process.
Yeah, I like where you took that, Ben, because since its inception over 30 years ago, IPCC has actually provided the science to the Framework Convention negotiations. And so every time we deliver a report, we make formal reports to the negotiating process and inform the parties to the negotiations so that they are very much kind of steeped in the science that the global community of scientists have kind of put together, which I think actually is an interesting policy challenge for us right now, Rachel, because we've just delivered most of the reports for the 6th cycle. We have one more report we'll deliver in March, the one ring that rules them all synthesis report. And then we're going to start into the 7th cycle. And, our cycles are usually 6 to 7 years long. So if you think about the math, we'll probably be kicking out our big assessments just at the end of this critical decade. So I think we have to kind of grapple with our policy relevance right now. Can we afford to be largely silent during this period where people are really pushing for ambitious action? And, some of us within the process are thinking about, could we just do an entire cycle with special reports? Because we're finding that our special reports are really relevant. It gives us a chance to dig deep into topics. And increasingly, people are not asking the question, is climate change happening very much anymore? They're asking, what about this little piece? Are we going to overshoot? What about extreme events? How are they affected? So you could actually envision a process where you just did special reports for the entire cycle and had them be very relevant to the decisions that people are making. So not really an answer to your question, Rachel, but Ben's answer made me kind of think that we are facing this very interesting policy challenge for the decade.
Fatima, is there anything you would like to add, or?
Yeah, climate change in itself is a contested issue, and there are many different forms of contestations. There are climate change deniers, I'd say. So I think the IPCC does serve as that sort of authoritative body, scientific body that is respected and valued, that can come with findings that I think the findings that have, stood the test of time because they've taken so long and the process itself is so rigorous. So I think when I hear that the IPCC says this, I pay attention, and most of the people I know pay attention. So I think we need that, especially in a world that is, faced with so many multiple storms and disruptions and turbulence. And we need to have that sort of voice, that authority, that sort of definitive sense of this is what is happening from a scientific perspective. Because I think without that, then we'll just be making our own conclusions. So I'd say that that's where I see the value of the IPCC, especially from a sign. And I think policymakers also need to hear that. They need to know, as the IPCC does, often come with language that is dangerous, high confidence. They need to know these things. So it's not just what they say, it's how it's framed. So I think it gives policymakers a sense of proximity of how bad the issues are and where do we need to start acting. That sense that this is not just about the science, it's also about the action, because it's a societal problem. And you cannot decouple society, from science. Science, if it's done properly, is supposed to serve society, and it's supposed to also solve social problems as well.
Great, thank you. And I think that that's actually a good transition to our next question, thinking about not only the role that society is playing, but also thinking about sort of the political processes. And so in any discussion of global policy process, there are always concerns about the ways that global politics can actually affect that process. So I'm wondering how issues like power politics or position within the global economy can affect the IPCC process.
That's it. Fatima, do you want to lead off with that? Because I think that one's right up your alley.
I can give a quick example in terms of my neck of the woods. For instance, the countries are all moving towards clean transition and breaking away from fossil fuel. Although with current dynamics and what's happening in Ukraine, it's not quite the same. But nonetheless, I'd say there are political economy issues that, are almost like the elephant in the room. If you take the example of natural gas, for instance, many African countries are very richly endowed in natural gas. And there was a period when they were more or less been told that they have to leave these fossil fuels in the ground and basically work towards renewable, which I think many countries are doing already. But in the IPCC process, how that translates in terms of your review and your assessment is sometimes quite tricky. Because there are certain things that the science is telling you, but there are certain things that you see from a political perspective. But you are only allowed to assess the scientific, if it's not in the literature, you can't talk about it. So sometimes there's some kind of an intellectual embargo, if I can put it that way, where you're not able to talk about these issues, at least in the way that you would want to. Mainly because you don't have the evidence, and if you don't have the evidence, then you're not going to be able to record it in your findings. But that's some of the, I would say, the contradictions that I see, where the issues are real. You know that people are going through it and they're facing it. Governments there are decision points. They need to know whether they should go with natural gas, or whether they should use natural gas as a transition fuel, or whether they should be sort of, leaving it in the ground and working towards renewable. And those decisions are very difficult. And I guess even an IPCC report might come with some recommendation. I mean, like I said, there's no explicit recommendation, but some of what the IPCC says may not be what a policymaker in this part of the world might want to do. Because they have a different reality. And very often they have a development imperative. So they're not able to consider IPCC reports in quite the same way. So those are things that I find a little bit difficult. And also as a person from the global south, I find it sometimes difficult in an IPCC process to put your thoughts. I mean, you can put your thoughts forward. You can argue with your colleagues, but again, as I said, the argument doesn't go very far because you don't have the evidence. And some of these things we haven't actually got to evidence point yet because they're actually very novel. They're actually very new. And once they knew, as long as they knew, you can't really talk about it in the way that one would hope to do. So those I'd say are things that are slightly tricky, I'd say, about the political economy issues where there are big states, but those states you're not able to go into details because it's simply not in the literature.
Yeah, I think to follow up on that, there's obviously an attempt to sort of take geopolitics off the table and let people focus on doing scientific assessment. And we have, leadership teams from the global north, we have global south, we have author teams from the global north and the global south. But I think building on Fatima's point, it's not really a level playing field. If you look at where the technical support units for different working groups are located, and this is sort of the back office administrative element of working groups, they tend to be located in Western, Northern developed nations, and partly that's a resourcing issue. I think the fact that we're assessing literature which is overwhelmingly produced by the global north, and we are assessing literature by and large which is in English, right? And so we have the opportunity to assess any literature in any language, assuming we have, people with the necessary language skills to discover, explore that literature on the author teams, and simple issues of the ability of authors to engage in a scientific assessment process in a language that isn't their native language. 2 cycles for me, that's really challenging. I mean, I speak a little bit of German, but trying to do a scientific assessment process in German would not be a good outcome. So the process, I wouldn't say the process is rigged, but I think we need to be honest about the imbalance in power that exists from at an institutional level and even down into the individual author teams. And I think the IPCC recognizes those issues, has tried to chip away at them over time, but some of these are sort of fundamental and difficult to overcome.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both of those comments. Although this cycle, I think we had a small TSU in each of the global south countries that were helping to lead the assessment process, so South Africa, China, and India, which is a step forward. We need to continue to do that and to build that capacity. But but it is true that, we realize as we seek to manage a very diverse process that we have a ways to go in terms of training up our convening lead authors, being attentive in our processes to diversity and inclusion. And I want to stress the inclusion part because often we've got, widely recognized leaders in the field who are leading chapters with folks who don't speak English as a first language or who haven't played on the international stage. And we recognize we really have to put the effort into training folks to be inclusive. You can imagine how daunting that might be if you're somebody new sitting in this process. Am I going to raise my hand, or am I going to be, kind of bullied by somebody who knows this issue and has been in place for many years? But I will say, and this is why I'm a big believer in IPCC, I think the consensus process that is, the basis of the way we do our work is powerful, and it levels the playing field some. Imagine you have 190 odd countries who are reaching consensus, like we don't vote, we reach consensus on every word in the summary. Now, anybody can make a power play by refusing to reach consensus. Nope, sorry, can't agree to that. That can be frustrating, and it makes for very, very long negotiations on the summaries. I will admit that. On the other hand, it makes us very creative, and it makes us listen, and we try to find a way that we maintain the scientific integrity while accommodating usually the policy positions of governments. And I find that powerful, and I don't think that power resides primarily in the global north. In fact, there are many countries who come into these negotiations who have a very strong position that we have to kind of work around. But because we work through that, at the end, you have a document that all the governments have agreed to, and that holds real power internationally.
Thank you. I think it's been very helpful for us hearing about how so much of this process works today. But I also wanted to think a little bit historically, since the world has changed quite a bit since the IPCC started its work in 1988. So have the needs of the policy community changed over time? And if so, has the IPCC been able to keep up with that changing landscape? And are there any specific adaptations that have been made, or even any aspects that you view as sort of the most innovative of the current IPCC process?
Well, maybe I'll jump in. You are the policy community. Individuals, subnational actors are more and more the policy community. It used to be that we delivered our reports to the Framework Convention and to governments, national governments. But now, more and more, it's individuals who are reading these reports. In fact, I would say that some of the most effective users of IPCC reports are youth advocates who know this science backwards and forwards and who use science to advocate for action. As a result, we've realized we have to stop talking jargon to ourselves. We're still working on that, but even our summaries are unintelligible to the average person sometimes. But we've actually really worked on it, and I think this cycle we've done a very good job. And you guys heard Deborah Roberts yesterday. She's one of the most effective communicators on this topic that I know. And we've had communication specialists work with us. Our figures, which are sometimes like 3 pages long, and the caption is even longer. We're like, okay, let's try to distill the story. What is the story, so that we can help folks like you who have a role to play in setting policy in your communities and in the spheres of influence that you have to better use this. So I think that's kind of a place where we are innovating, and we need to innovate more.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, Deborah alluded to this, and if you didn't gather yesterday, Deborah's a staunch champion for the practitioners out there in the world. And as my co-chair, it was a constant refrain of like, so what? What are you telling people out there who are wrestling with this problem? But I think that's, a reflection of how sort of the policy questions have changed, over 30 years, where we were once trying to ask the question of, was the climate changing and are human beings involved in that, sort of asked and answered quite a while ago, and now people are much more focused on what do I do about it, and what do I do about it right here in my community, and that brings in, requires kind of a different skill set, a different approach to assessment. In terms of innovation, I think, it might be a little pedestrian, but I think the fact that during the 6th assessment cycle, we moved everything into a virtual environment. That was pretty impressive. I would say it was painful, but and in some ways, we missed out. But so instead of having to fly to another country and show up and join a meeting jet lagged, you got the leisure of staying at home and calling in at 3 o'clock in the morning to a meeting. I don't know how that played out, but do bear in mind that a big chunk of the 6 assessment cycle was done virtually across all 3 working groups, and that was a pretty impressive accomplishment, even the approval sessions. So, hats off to the IPCC and the authors and the governments for pulling that off.
Can I just pick up on that last point before you go to Fatima? One of the really interesting benefits of virtual, although it was challenging to do things just on a Zoom screen, is that we had more representation from Global South countries. Because usually we pay for 1 or 2 people to come fly to whatever venue we were hosting this meeting in. And I think it was like 75% increase in the delegates who could attend from the Global South, which is not something to just quickly overlook. That was really powerful. It was helpful to level the playing field in terms of capacity in the meeting, but also starting to build that capacity for the future.
Yeah, maybe I could just add 2 points. I'd say in terms of innovation or things that I've seen that the IPCC have done over the course of the years, one is on the thematic side. There is a sense that the IPCC has actually embraced themes that I would say are very complex, but with a view to wanting to have a sense of where's the evidence of how these issues have been dealt with practically. If you take issues like adaptation and mitigation, or look at adaptation and mitigation from the interlinkages between these two, I'd say when the IPCC started doing this, it was a very pioneering subject area because there were not many examples of how adaptation and mitigation come together, or what are the synergies or benefits of doing both. But one was forced to look at the evidence and assess that. So I think it has moved from these very biophysical aspects to thematic areas that are complex. But at the same time, the IPCC is not afraid to embrace those areas. So it's quite innovative in that sense. Even issues on poverty, on gender, those were formally considered as issues that are, perhaps not quite in line with the conventional literature, but those are also very important and have made their way into the IPCC literature and findings. So that's very good. The other thing I'd say is, I think Ben referred to that, is there are ways of democratizing the IPCC process through the outreach events. And I think that the outreach events are a way of saying to the policymakers, the entrepreneurs, to all of those stakeholders that may not feel very concerned where IPCC reports are, with regard to IPCC reports. But when you have the outreach event, it's like these reports are talking to them. Again, it's an attempt to bring more proximity to these stakeholders, to talk to the policymakers in a way that you would not do in the reports. So the findings are more or less distilled and broken into bits. Messages are conveyed to a policymaker to say, take note, this is important, it's coming your way, you might want to deal with it. And the same with the businessman, the entrepreneur, the youth. So I think it's a very inclusive process, the outreach event. And that's very innovative because IPCC is in many ways saying, we don't want to be just an imperial science. We don't want to just sit there. We want to come down a bit and want to come down and make sure that the science we're producing is talking to people. Because science, again, like I said, has to be talking to society. Science has to have a relevance for society. Otherwise, it's a science that is of little value. So I think I see evidence of how the IPCC is slowly but surely democratizing its process and its findings.
Great, thank you. This is very helpful to hear not just sort of the innovations that have taken place, but also how those innovations, it sounds like, have made this a much more inclusive process, both for those taking part in the process, but also those who are sort of reading and actually digesting that information. And so I think along this vein, it would be very helpful to demystify what that actually looks like a little bit further. And so many of us have heard about the IPCC and read its reports, but the process, which I know you've each alluded to in different parts of answers, is still a bit of a mystery. So what would you like us to know about that process? Are there any challenges that you or others have faced being a part of it? Or, what is the take home that we should all know about the IPCC reports? Or the reporting process, excuse me.
Want to go first, Brett?
Sure. So I think building off that previous question, I mean, one thing I think to keep in mind is that we were just talking about changes in the IPCC process. I think it's also to recognize what hasn't changed in the IPCC process. It's still built around 3 working groups that attempt to integrate, but that's sort of a constant struggle, and that creates some challenges. It's still very much steeped in assess the scientific literature. And I think that puts some constraints on what kind of knowledge can be brought into the assessment process. So those are things to bear in mind. But as going through a couple of cycles of the IPCC. I mean, think of it this way, right? So imagine you are transported to a far off land. You're dropped in a conference room with 12 other people that you do not know, and maybe some of which you might know by reputation, some of which you may have never heard of at all. You're handed 4 bullet points that are somewhat confusing, which is supposed to be, this is what your chapter is going to cover, and you're told, go to work and bring us a draft of a chapter in a few months. It's essentially what happens, right? And it's and get it done now because you have this week, and then you're not going to be together again for 6 months or a year, right? So it's as that's a fun process, it's also a difficult process to get stuff done in. But I mean, I think coming away from this last cycle, I think 2 things I think are particularly challenging. I mean, one is just the volume of literature that now exists across all working groups, particularly working group 2, which is where I'm involved in. I mean, it's increased exponentially, and 6 years ago I've said it increased exponentially. So it's been increasing exponentially for about a decade. And I mean, if you take a chapter, the bulk of the length of the chapter is made up from the references at the end of the chapter that are cited within the chapter. So as a part-time volunteer assessor, trying to get your heads around this massive literature and do it justice is really difficult. And it's also, in addition to just the volume, it's the diversity, right? So a lot of additional disciplines, particularly from the social sciences and the policy sciences, have come into this space. And that's great. It's added to the richness, but it's just, a new language, a new disciplinary language that you have to get your heads around. And this is why, to some extent, you see the size of the IPCC reports ballooning. So as Deborah said, working group 2, 4,000 odd pages. You're not giving that away as a present at the holidays. And I think the other dimension that's really challenging is, conducting a dispassionate, objective assessment of the literature. I think as awareness and the urgency of climate change has progressed, it's increasingly difficult for those of us who care about this issue to just sit at a table and look objectively at information. Think about adaptation, like, yes, you can build a seawall, or you can retreat, or you can use nature-based solutions. Take your pick. They're all sort of treated with some degree of equivalency. And I think many of us who work on these issues would, have issues with that. And so we see this in the assessment process where, even as authors, we have preferences for certain forms of knowledge in certain disciplines, and we bring our own values into the process. And that's something we all have to wrestle with. I think some authors do it better than other authors, but that's where the process really kicks in and becomes important, because we have to be accountable. We have to be accountable to our fellow authors who go, well, that's great, but what about this literature? You have to be accountable to governments who understand the value of the IPCC text and the words, and will be quick to call you out on anything that smells of bias. But at the end of the day, I think the process works. But as an author in the trenches, it can be a wild ride.
Is there anything either Fatima or Ko that you would like to add?
Yeah, maybe a few points. I guess one of them is that, like Ben described it, when you were in the room with IPCC authors and you were all trying to figure out, how to think about key messages that you might want to convey in your report. I mean, these are very often dynamic relationships, right? And they're not often easy. I've seen a massive change when I started with IPCC work. First of all, I've seen a change in gender relations, because when I was part of it at the very early days, there was definitely a discernible gender dynamic. You can feel it. You can feel it, and you lived it. When you were discussing these issues with your menfolk in the same room, it was very hard to kind of get a word in edgeways, because those that wanted to kind of say this is it, this is where we're headed, went along and did that without any compromise, and so it wasn't easy negotiating those sort of relationships, but you realize that you had to, and I think there's an integrity issue about it as well. If you know that something has been said in a literature, and your colleagues or people you're writing the chapter with haven't considered that, then there is an intellectual integrity that you have to bring it to light. You have to tell them that, yes, there is another literature that disputes what you're saying, and those things have to be said. So that was one. The second part of it, I think there's a development, and I think Ben alluded to this, there's a developed dynamics there. I mean, it's honest to just make that point. If you're coming from a developing country, very often you don't have the research infrastructure. There were times in the IPCC process where they would fly people to South Africa because that was a place where they could find all the peer reviews, journals, etc. Because a typical African university might not have these journals. And if you don't have the journals, that means that your research is somewhat, not very comprehensive. And you might say things that might not reflect the reality. So there's that aspect. And I guess there's also the aspect that, like the gender dynamics, you also have to, developing countries, in terms of numbers have increased. I think I was looking at this the other day, from AR5 to AR6, representation in terms of developing authors from developing countries grew from 33% to 47%. And so that's quite impressive. But that said, I think there's still a need to really, cast the net as wide as possible so that more developing authors from developing countries could be part of this pool and be able to contribute, because science, that science is important, and it's important for everyone, irrespective of where you come from. I would even argue that developing countries do need the science even more because they're at a level of the climate change and climate impact that they have, an intrinsic need for it in terms of how they can change their policies, how they may avoid a wrong course or wrong pathway, and how they may be able to bring other stakeholders in the process. They could lead the process, I often argue, but provided they have the knowledge. So it's vitally important for the IPCC's future to find new ways also of sourcing more authors from developing countries so that they could be part of the pool. One last point I forgot to mention is the aspect of grey literature. I think IPCC has made tremendous changes and I'd say inroads where grey literature is concerned. But the fact of the matter is that much of the literature in the global south is very grey. It's still grey, euphemistically called grey literature, but also very relevant. And although the IPCC has found ways of how you could cite this, so it's not a discriminatory kind of thing, but some people still feel that because it's grey, somehow it doesn't have that sort of authority or that sort of the compelling aspect that you will get from literature that's peer-reviewed doesn't come with the grey literature. So those, I think, are still there, and we need to find ways of, addressing those problems.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add, I agree with everything that Fatima just said. The way I think about this in terms of gender, in terms of global South representation among the author group, in terms of bringing in indigenous knowledge, is that we are attempting here to solve one of the most complex problems the world has ever faced. And if we're going to do that properly, we need to do it thinking about all the diversity and innovation we can bring to the table. That means women, it means scientists from the global South, it means knowledge wherever it exists. And I really take your point, Fatima, about grey literature. And it's really incumbent upon us to make a safe space for us to have a fully inclusive conversation. Because, you don't want a bunch of white guys from the same university sitting around the table trying to solve this problem. You really need people thinking in different ways, challenging each other, saying, well, what about this? Because, it's interesting if you look at where innovation comes from. You can't actually plod yourself forward towards innovation. Sometimes it's inspirational and comes from a place you never anticipated. So increasing the number of women who are in the process, which means working with governments to nominate women. Increasing the number of global South scientists. Professor Lee spoke yesterday about the scholarship program that we have that the Rose Waters Prize is now contributing to. Since its inception, we have educated 79 PhD students. We don't currently have a process to bring them into the IPCC authorship process. It's kind of a missed opportunity. We've got all of these folks who we're training up. We need to bring them to meetings. We need to start to have them participate, because that's what we have uniquely to bring to this table. We can say, let's have you be a chapter scientist. Start to work within this process. And I think that over time will help to build the cadre of diverse scientists we need involved in the process.
Thank you. So I have other questions, but I'm going to hold off. I'm keeping an eye on the time. So I do want to turn to our audience, both those joining us in person and those who are joining us on YouTube Live. And we have a little bit of time to take some questions from all of you. And as a reminder, we are an undergraduate serving institution, so I do want to prioritize those questions coming from students, either in person or on YouTube. So is there anyone in the room who would like to be bold and ask the first question? As we do have some questions from YouTube Live, but. All right, I'll let your coffee sink in for, sorry, I didn't see. Hold on, someone with a microphone is coming to you.
Thank you. Do you have any recommendations for policymakers using the report?
Well, I'll just jump in. It depends on what kind of policymaker you are. If you're looking at the resilience, adaptation, impact side of things, I think you really have to dig into the report. For say, like the physical science report, the Working Group 1 report, you can read the summary and get a pretty good sense of what the major issues are. But when you're talking about adaptation, which is so meaningfully place-based, I find, and Deborah, you can correct me if I'm kind of off base here, but I find that as you aggregate up, you lose really important information about the experience in a place, in a case study. So for that, if you're a resilience policymaker, I say dig in. And that report has amazing facts. Can trees solve the climate problem? There's just a whole bunch of really accessible Q&As and frequently asked questions. So that's just a quick response.
Yeah, to follow up on that, from experience, I worked in a nonprofit, climate policy organization 15 odd years ago. This is after the third assessment report. And I did not read it cover to cover. I used it as a reference, as a cheat sheet, a really big cheat sheet, right? So, and my job was to sort of communicate about the science within the IPCC report. And so what I would do is sort of, as Co is describing, is I would find this issue within the IPCC and look at what case studies are cited, what literature is cited, and I would go from there into those case studies and that literature using other literature, other documentation, to dig deeper and get an understanding around that particular issue. But IPCC is this really handy reference for pointing you in the right direction to find, deeper information on a topic you're interested in.
Yeah, perhaps the point to make is that IPCC reports are usually quite daunting because they're quite big, voluminous reports, and that's why the SPM matters, the summary for policymakers. But that said, I think the regional chapters are taken very seriously. I think the regional chapters are very helpful because they contextualize the problem, within a certain locality, and you're able to see how big some of those issues are. So it gives you a more granular sort of sense of, what you need to do. And I think that more effort needs to be put in the outreach because that's possibly one way of reaching out to policymakers, telling them that they matter. We did a synthesis where we tried to basically look at the report from an African perspective, the Africa chapter, but for parliamentarians in Ghana. And they found it very helpful because these are people that have to make laws and they have to discuss about budgetary issues. And if they don't understand the full impact of, climate change, then they're going to be quite limited in terms of the discussions that they normally have in Parliament, and also in terms of lives and livelihoods as well. So I think we need to find ways of making the report more accessible. I think the communication part matters because policymakers may be daunted. Many policymakers in this part of the world are also specialists. We should make the assumption that they don't know what this is about. They're specialists. They're specialists in the areas of IPCC. But they don't have the time to kind of delve into this. So I think for that reason alone, we need to kind of try and make it more accessible. And the language matters. The language that we use, the messages that we convey, how we source out the stakeholders, I think matters. We can't just be talking to ourselves. We need to also identify the policymakers and middle-level policymakers, I think, matter as well. Because more of the permanent secretaries and those sort of people may not have time, but the middle-level policymakers would have time. So yeah, it's an approach that I think we need to work harder at to get more people to understand the implications of climate change.
Great. So I do see your hand. I'm going to take a question from our virtual audience, and then we will come back to you. So Mattia Felicitias asks, is the IPCC collecting any information regarding research-based policy implementation and the successes or shortfalls of those initiatives?
Are we? I don't think we are.
Yeah. So I think systematically, no. I think we are, after 30 years of work, people, as we talked about yesterday, people have been adapting to climate change. People have been pursuing opportunities to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. And because some of that's been going on for a while, there are case studies where we can look at what's been implemented in a particular place. And we might have learned, assuming it was published in the literature, how that particular opportunity played out. And I think there's some good news stories and there's some not so good news stories. But I think it's still very much at this sort of case study level. I think this is potentially a new frontier for the IPCC because it's exactly the kind of question I think the policymakers are asking is like, okay, well, you've told us what we can do about it. We started doing that. Now we need to know like what's working and what's not working and what the trade-offs and externalities and benefits are. And that comes from practice, right? And so I think trying to do a more systematic job of collecting that information, but also that means getting that information into the literature. I think there's a real opportunity space for IPCC to innovate and continue to contribute to the policy process.
Do we have time to take one more? Okay. So I see you right in the middle, kind of, someone will come to you with a microphone, just in the middle by the camera.
So you mentioned the importance of other kinds of knowledge, including gray literature and indigenous ways of knowing. I was wondering if the IPCC has any ways in which you're trying to include indigenous sovereign nations in the approval or writing process.
That's definitely for you.
Yeah, that's for me. I think we recognize that we need to do a better job of embracing indigenous authors and indigenous knowledge. It's an interesting question, though, right? Because while sometimes the co-chairs of the working groups will nominate their own folks as potential authors, we really do depend on governments to nominate authors. So in a sense, I think, we need to maybe work that angle to encourage folks to think about their indigenous populations as a part of the nominating group that should be put forward. And that's a great suggestion. I think we could maybe think about that. Obviously we encourage people to nominate women, and why couldn't we also say, look, we need this information and we need that to be a focus of your nominating process.
And I would just say, I think this is a really interesting question and idea. Should the Navajo Nation, for example, have an opportunity to nominate authors into the IPCC process and have its own, table in a plenary approval session? That's fascinating, right? And no, that capacity does not exist at present, and that gets back to the sort of issues of equity and political economy of the IPCC process. But that's a really intriguing idea.
I know I have more questions, and there are some more from those online as well, but I believe I am out of time. I think that's the cue I'm getting here.
I'm very sorry. I have to play that role here. Thank you very much for an excellent panel discussion. So this concludes the session. Thank you to our audience here, to the virtual audience. Our next session will be starting at 10 o'clock. The topic for that session, I've got my cheat sheet here. Actually, it started at 10:30. It's on land, ecosystems, and climate change. So I hope you'll join us for that. And there is some very good coffee in the lobby, and if you want to pursue some of this conversation in the lobby, that maybe you can find some of our speakers out there as well. Thank you very much.
Bye, Fatima.
Lost her.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you.
I hope to get to the last few questions.
So one of the things I was interested in your talking about the process.
Yeah,
no worries. Appreciate your comments a lot. On the last one on indigenous too, I was also just wondering about groups that don't have very much, like Kurds, Uyghurs, huge populations that obviously feel injustice. Is there any inclusion of those groups as well?
No, because IPCC is intergovernmental. Right? So if you are not a government entity, you essentially don't have a voice other than if the government entity opens up that opportunity.
So that's also a huge factor then in terms of global power dynamics, because
this matters.
I'll let some other folks come in. Turkey's the same with Kurds. Like, they don't want the Kurds to have any say on what happens to, for example, like water usage in northern Iraq and southeast Turkey. But the Kurds will have a place at the table. So it's interesting and to what extent is IPCC's role
You want to come
include
Well, honestly, it becomes a battle, right? So the Chinese delegation will basically do research on all documents looking for references to and if you come into this like, well, I'm just writing, because this is what I do, and I'm a researcher, and you write things like that, boom. You find it, they're like, this goes there, it's very similar, just like, this is not the official name, or this country does not exist,
Is there anything else that
They are ruthless. They will not let that go. Which I imagine, and that's a place that other people recognize as a country. So I imagine other geographies and people.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for the moment to say something. No. It's not
That's why I was like, can I sneak in another question? I can smell the coffee. Okay, I can.
right. I'm sure people were like ready to go. Yeah.
So no, there were a bunch of groups online. So I'm just gonna check in with Lindsay.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Thursday. No, I go back to LA. Yeah, no worries, thanks.
Okay, thanks, man.
Yep, cheers.
Also, Ben, I really liked your comment about when you were thinking about what would happen if the IPCC wasn't there.
Yeah.
I sometimes was wondering that myself, and I really, I think having a solid consensus in base.
Yeah, I know, and it's that sort of point occurred to me because I was just like, do we really need like more thousands of pages of this? And I was pretty down on the whole process.
Right.
And then try to do the counterfactual, and it was like, I imagine like you stop doing these assessments, and countries can come along and be like, well, but that knowledge is old.
Right.
It may be like we've learned more since then, and it's not captured, and so therefore, it really, and so it creates this codependency.
Right.
So like, does that mean we're stuck now doing assessments
Forever and
ever? There's kind of that flavor to it, which is a little what you have to think about, but
Right.
Yeah.
100% and everything else. Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah. Well,
So cool. I'm gonna find some.
I know in the lobby there's
Yeah,
food and
thanks.
everything.
Downstairs?
coffee,
Yeah. All right, I'll head there.